The heat from the jet wash was practically melting the asphalt, but I couldn't stop running. I was sprinting directly across the red line at Joint Base Andrews, the lethal force. Perimeter where trespassers are usually neutralized before they even hear the shot. Behind me, I could hear a voice screaming over the deafening roar of the engines. It was my father, Colonel Rhett Mason, a man who worshipped military regulations as if they were scripture. He was clinging to the chain-link fence in the civilian viewing area, his face contorted, in pure agonizing terror as he watched me violate the most sacred rule of the tarmac. "Get down, Lena. They'll fire if you run. For God's sake, get on the ground." I saw the Secret Service counter-assault team raise their rifles, the red laser dots dancing across my chest for a fraction of a second. My father's scream hit a fever pitch, a sound of absolute despair, but then the lead agent saw my face. He didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he tapped his earpiece and lowered his weapon, signaling the others to stand down. Ahead of me, the massive rear stairs of the VC-25 Air Force One didn't retract. As they prepared for takeoff, they lowered further, screeching down to meet me. I didn't stop to wave. I just checked my watch, knowing I was cutting it terrifyingly close. To my father, it looked like a suicide run. To me, it was just a Tuesday. But to understand why I was sprinting toward the president's plane while my family watched from the cheap seats, you have to go back 48 hours. We were sitting in a steakhouse, celebrating my father's retirement, surrounded by the smell of expensive scotch and self-importance. He was holding court at the head of the table, his hand resting proudly on the shoulder of my brother Tyler, a newly minted lieutenant who had yet to shine his own boots. Dad was beaming, raising a glass to Tyler as the only one continuing the family legacy. I sat at the far end of the table, picking at my salad, feeling that familiar heavy invisible weight settle over me. It was the same weight I felt when he skipped my grad school graduation for Tyler's basic training send-off. The same weight from every birthday he forgot while deployed. In his eyes, if you didn't wear a uniform, you didn't matter. I was just Lena, the civilian disappointment who worked with computers. That's when my pocket vibrated against my leg. It wasn't a text from a friend, it was a secure alert on my government-issued device. I slid it out under the table, my heart skipping a beat as I saw the banner. DEFCON status update, flash traffic, eyes only. A geopolitical crisis was unfolding in real time, and I needed to acknowledge the receipt immediately. But before I could tap the screen, a hand slammed down on the table, rattling the silverware. The entire restaurant seemed to go silent as my father glared at me, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Put the damn toy away, Lena," he snarled, his voice dripping with public humiliation. "We are talking about service and sacrifice, about real heroes, and you're sitting there checking social media, playing games?" He laughed, a harsh barking sound that invited everyone else to join in. "God, you and that little freelance hobby. Do you think fixing Wi-Fi gives you the right to ignore your brother's achievement?" He turned back to the table, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Let her play with her phone. Some of us have real work to do." I stared at him, my thumb hovering over a command that would reroute satellite coverage for the entire northern hemisphere. He thought I was ignoring him to play Candy Crush. He didn't know I was the only reason the Eastern power grid was still online. But to show him the truth, I wouldn't just have to tell him. I'd have to show him a clearance level he didn't even know existed. My father didn't just respect the military, he believed it was the only valid form of human existence, the only yardstick by which a life could be measured. In his world, if you didn't have a rank pinned to your collar or a ribbon rack on your chest, you were essentially a ghost, present, but not really there. He spent the entire day badgering me about the upcoming Air Power Expo at Andrews Air Force Base, treating it like a mandatory deployment rather than a family outing. He kept talking about bearing and discipline, lecturing me while I folded laundry like I was a fresh recruit who couldn't even make a bed properly. He looked at me with this pitiful, weary expression, shaking his head as if my choice to wear a blazer instead of fatigues was a personal failure he had to apologize for. "You need to come, Lena," he insisted, his voice taking on that drill sergeant edge that made my stomach turn. "You need to see what real service looks like, Maybe if you see Tyler standing with his unit, you'll understand why we push him so hard. Why his work matters. He didn't say and why yours doesn't. But the silence at the end of the sentence screamed it loud and clear. I just nodded, biting my tongue until I tasted copper. I wanted to scream that I served too, that my battlefield was digital and my uniform was anonymity. But I knew it wouldn't land. To him, service without public recognition wasn't service. It was loitering. I swallowed the insult, adding it to the mental archive I'd been keeping since childhood. I saw the piano recitals he skipped because he was on duty, contrasted against the way he cleared his entire calendar for Tyler's ROTC orientation. I saw the way he framed Tyler's acceptance letter to the academy, while my acceptance to a top-tier cybersecurity program was met with a shrug and a murmur about its support. It was a suffocating claustrophobic narrative, where I was always the supporting character, in their hero's journey, the civilian failure who just didn't have the grit to make the cut. But the reality of my life, the one he refused to see, was colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. While he was lecturing me on the importance of hierarchy, he had no idea that my biometrics were already cleared for the highest level of executive access in the country. My civilian job wasn't fixing printers or debugging email servers. I was a Tier 1 asset within the executive branch. I lived in a world of Yankee white clearance, a designation so restrictive that even most high-ranking officers never smell it. My office was a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility where the air was scrubbed, the walls were lead-lined, and the stakes were always life or death. I remember walking into the secure briefing room that same afternoon to prep the grid. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and recycled oxygen, a sharp contrast to the stuffy humidity of my parents' house. I sat at my terminal, fingers flying across the keys as I initiated the daily crypto key rotation for the secure comms network. A shadow fell over my desk, but I didn't look up immediately. General Vance, a 3-star commander who usually terrified his subordinates into absolute silence, was standing there. In my father's world, I should have snapped to attention, saluted, and waited for permission to breathe. But here, the physics of power were different. I held up a single finger, 1 minute, General, and finished the sequence. Watching the sat-link saturation levels stabilize on the monitor, only then did I swivel my chair. The general hadn't barked or demanded respect. He had waited, patiently, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "We're green across the board, sir," I said, my voice flat and professional. He didn't reprimand me for the delay. He nodded with genuine relief. He knew that without my sign-off his birds didn't fly, and his communications went dark. In that room, the stars on his shoulder meant less than the encryption keys in my head. Then, the notification came through, shattering the fragile balance I was trying to maintain between my two lives. The president's schedule had shifted. A sudden diplomatic emergency in Geneva required an immediate, unscheduled departure. The football, the nuclear launch codes, and the secure communications package move with him, and that meant I moved with him. I checked the manifest, and there was my name, right at the top of the technical support detail. My stomach dropped as I cross-referenced the flight time. The departure was scheduled for 1,400 hours on Saturday, the exact same time my father had demanded we be at the flight line to watch the aerial demonstration. It was a logistical nightmare, a perfect storm of professional duty and familial obligation crashing into each other. I couldn't tell my father why I had to be there. The Geneva trip was classified until wheels up. I couldn't back out of the airshow without confirming his belief that I was lazy and unpatriotic. And I certainly couldn't miss the flight because without me, the President of the United States would be flying blind in a hostile digital airspace. I realized with a grim certainty that I was going to have to attend the air show. And then I was going to have to leave it in the most spectacular way possible. My father spent 30 years saluting generals. He had no idea that those same generals spent their mornings waiting for my daily briefing. And when the president's plane wheels up, rank doesn't matter. Access does. The very important persontent smelled of diesel fumes and stale popcorn, a sensory mix that usually made me nostalgic, but today just made me nauseous. We were agonizingly close to the action, 50 yards from the restricted flight line, separated only by heavy gauge chain-link fencing and a phalanx of Secret Service agents who looked ready to tackle a stiff breeze. My father was practically vibrating with excitement, lecturing Tyler on the history of the airfield, completely ignoring the fact that I was scanning the perimeter, counting the snipers on the hangar roofs. To him, I was just tagging along, the baggage he couldn't leave at home, the daughter who needed to be babysat while the men discussed important things. Then, the vibration hit my hip. It was a specific pattern. 3 sharp pulses, 1 long hold. My secure pager. I glanced down discreetly, angel eyes moving. Wheels up in 15. The blood drained from my face. The president's schedule had accelerated. The leisurely departure was now an immediate extraction, and I was stuck in the civilian peanut gallery. I didn't have time to argue, and I certainly didn't have time to ask for permission. I had to merge my 2 worlds right now, or the most powerful plane on Earth would leave without its primary cyber defense lead. I pulled out my phone, bypassing the lock screen with a biometric scan. I didn't call a taxi. I texted the special agent in charge, Walker, a man I'd pulled out of a digital blackout in Sudan. My thumbs moved with practice speed. Asset perimeter breach inbound at Sector 4, requesting immediate escort to AF-1. It was insane, calling in a breach on myself. If I was wrong, I'd be in handcuffs within seconds. If I was right, I'd be on the plane. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. My father's head snapped toward me, his face twisting into a scowl. He saw the phone, he saw me moving, and he snapped. "Sit down, Lena," he barked, his voice cutting through the crowd noise. "The president is landing. Show some damn respect." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the anger, sure, but I also saw the arrogance of a man who thought he knew every rule in the book. I reached into my pocket and pinned a small black enamel square to my lapel. To him, it was costume jewelry. To the sniper scope currently centered on my chest, it was a badge of immunity. "I am showing respect, Dad," I said, my voice quiet but harder than steel. "By doing my job." He told me to sit down and watch history happen. I decided it was time to go make it. I checked the time, took a breath, and stepped toward the one line you never cross. I didn't hesitate. I planted my hand on the metal rail of the VIP barrier and vaulted over it in a single, fluid motion, my heels hitting the restricted concrete with a slap that echoed louder than the crowd's collective gasp. For a split second, there was a stunned silence, the kind of vacuum that exists right before chaos erupts, and then I heard my father's voice tear through the air. It wasn't the angry, commanding bark I was used to. It was a raw, jagged scream of pure panic, stripped of all its military posturing. "Lena, stop, you're going to get shot. Oh my God, get down." I started sprinting. To him, this wasn't an extraction, it was a mental breakdown. He was watching his disappointing civilian daughter commit suicide by cop on a federal airfield. I could feel the heat radiating off the tarmac, the smell of burnt kerosene filling my lungs, but I kept my eyes locked on the massive blue and white silhouette ahead of me. I knew exactly what he was seeing: snipers shifting on the rooftops, heavy weapons swinging. Toward me, the lethal machinery of the state waking up to crush an intruder. I heard him screaming again, his voice cracking, "Don't kill her, she's sick, she doesn't know what she's doing." Then came the agents. They converged on me from the periphery, a blur of dark suits and sunglasses moving with terrifying speed. My father must have closed his eyes then, bracing for the tackle, for the violence that happens when you break the rules he held so dear. But the impact never came. Instead of slamming me into the pavement, the agents moved into a seamless, synchronized dance around me. They didn't arrest me, they engulfed me. In seconds, they had formed a tight, protective diamond, a phalanx formation, designed to shield a high-value target from hostile lines of sight. They weren't stopping me, they were pacing me, matching my stride perfectly, their bodies acting as human armor as we surged toward the plane. And then, the impossible happened. The rear engines of the VC-25 were already whining, a high-pitched scream that usually signals an immediate departure, but the plane didn't move. Instead, the rear air stairs began to unfold. They descended with a hydraulic hiss, a mechanical carpet being rolled out, specifically for the woman my father had just told to sit down and be quiet. I hit the bottom step without slowing down, the adrenaline finally giving way to a cold, sharp clarity. As I grabbed the handrail, movement in the cockpit window caught my eye. The pilot, a full bird colonel with silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders, leaned out. In my father's world, a colonel was a god, a figure of unquestionable authority who demanded reverence. But this colonel looked down at me, and he snapped a crisp, unwavering salute. It wasn't a courtesy, it was a recognition of command. I paused on the third step. I shouldn't have done it. Professionalism dictates you get in the bird and go. But the internal ledger demanded a payment. I turned back toward the fence. I saw my father pressed against the chain link, his fingers white where. He gripped the wire, his mouth hanging open in a caricature of disbelief. He looked small. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just raised my left hand and tapped my watch twice. It was the exact same gesture he had used on me 1,000 times, when I was late for dinner, when I took too long on a test, when I wasn't moving fast enough for his liking. Time management, Lena. The world doesn't wait for you. As I turned back to the door, I saw a Secret Service agent near the fence turn to my father. I couldn't hear the words over the engines, but I knew the script. The agent placed a hand on his earpiece, looked at my stunned father, and delivered the news that would shatter his reality. Sir, step back. That is a national security asset. She has the football protocols. He watched the stairs retract. He watched the engines flare. And as the most powerful plane in the world lifted off, he finally realized that the failure of the family was the only one flying aboard it. The moment the heavy, pressurized door of Air Force One sealed shut behind me, the world changed instantly. The roar of the engines, the screaming mechanical fury that had defined the chaos on the tarmac, was instantly cut off, replaced by the low, steady hum of the environmental systems. The air inside didn't smell like jet fuel or panic. It smelled like coffee, conditioned leather, and absolute unwavering competence. I took a breath, letting the recycled oxygen fill my lungs, and for the first time in 48 hours, my heart rate began to slow. I wasn't the disappointing daughter here. I wasn't the civilian who didn't understand real service. I was home. I walked past the communications rack, my fingers brushing against the servers I had personally configured. The chief of staff, Marcus, a man who ran the West Wing with a terrifying efficiency, looked up from a stack of briefing papers. He didn't ask why I was out of breath. He didn't ask why I had boarded 3 minutes before wheels up. He just gave me a curt nod, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of compromised judgment. Cut it closely, he murmured, before turning back to his work. We need the encryption rotation live before we hit cruising altitude. That was it. No lectures, no drama. Just the expectation of excellence. I sat at my terminal, plugged in my hardline, and felt the tension in my shoulders dissolve. I was essential here. I was respected. But as the plane began its taxi, my mind drifted back to the ground. To the man left standing on the other side of the fence. I didn't need a satellite feed to know exactly what was happening on that tarmac. My father, Colonel Mason, the man who had built his entire identity around the sanctity of the chain of command, was currently standing in the jet wash of his own ignorance. I imagined the silence that must have fallen over the very important person tent as the agents holstered their weapons and melted away. He would be staring at the empty space where the stairs had been, his mind trying to reconcile two impossible facts. His daughter was a failure, and his daughter just boarded the president's plane with a phalanx escort. The humiliation wouldn't come from the public spectacle, it would come from the realization that it was self-inflicted. I knew my brother, Tyler, the freshly minted lieutenant who had spent his life chasing Dad's approval, would be the one to twist the knife, even if he didn't mean to. I could hear his voice, filled with a mix of awe and confusion, asking the question that would haunt my father for the rest of his life. Dad, did you know? He would ask, looking at the retreating aircraft. Did you know she was Yankee White? That question would hang in the air like toxic smoke. Yankee White isn't just a clearance, it's a lifestyle of intrusive scrutiny, a badge of trust that the government hands out to fewer people than there are billionaires. For a retired colonel to realize he had been living under the same roof as a Tier 1 asset and treated her like IT support. That was a failure of intelligence that no amount of medals could cover. He hadn't just underestimated me, he had been completely blind to the reality of the war I was fighting. 6 months later, the silence between us had solidified into a cold protective barrier. I was in Geneva, standing in the back of a gilded ballroom while the president gave a keynote address on digital sovereignty. I wasn't in the spotlight, I never am, but the camera crews caught me. A brief pan of the room, a 2-second shot of me walking behind the delegation with my tablet in hand, looking focused and untouchable. Back in my hotel room that night, looking out over the dark water of Lake Geneva, my phone buzzed. It wasn't a secure alert this time. It was a standard text message. Saw you on CNN, it read. We should talk about your career path. There are opportunities in the private sector I can help you navigate. I stared at the screen, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a dull sense of recognition. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission that he was wrong. It was a pivot. He saw that I was winning, and now he wanted to be the coach. He wanted to reframe my success as something he could guide, something he could take credit for navigating. He couldn't accept me as an equal, so he was trying to re-establish himself as the mentor of a success story he had actively tried to suppress. I thought about the years of internal ledger entries, the missed events, the snide comments, the way he looked at me on the tarmac with genuine pity before the agents moved in. I realized I didn't need his validation to be elite. I didn't need him to understand my world for it to be real. My clearance wasn't granted by him, and my legacy wouldn't be defined by him. I didn't type a reply. I didn't explain. I simply pressed archive, sending the message into the digital void where irrelevant data goes to die. I had work to do. My father spent his life warning me about crossing lines. He never understood that for people like me, the lines aren't there to keep us out. They're there to keep everyone else away from us. If you've ever had to leave your family behind to find your true altitude, like this video and subscribe. Welcome to the detail.